Okay, you're listening to KWMR, and we have our guest, Scott Bollens, who's the Warmington Endowed Chair of Peace and International Cooperation at UC Irvine, and also a professor of city and regional planning, how we met decades ago. And he's reinvented himself yet again as a fiction author of a dystopian, yet, in my view, eerily plausible fiction set in a not too distant future. So he's going to talk to us about his two most recent novels. One is called Reform, and one is called Restart. So Scott, welcome to KWMR. Good morning.
Good morning, Michael, and welcome to the listeners.
Well, I've been looking forward to having you on the show for a while, and it's just so fascinating to me now that I've retired from being a city and regional planning professor and plotting my own next steps in terms of creative productivity. And so I wanted to chat with you about your, let's call it a transition, even though you're still a full-time professor, producing scholarship and teaching and mentoring doctoral students and all those good things. You've written a couple of, in my view, very interesting novels, fictions, that could you say they stem from your work and your research?
Definitely, Michael. For many years, I studied the real world, traumatized cities throughout the world, Jerusalem, Belfast, Beirut, places like that, deeply troubled and traumatized by conflict. And during the last presidential administration and the pandemic, when things were really crazy, I got really angry, and I'm at the latter stages of my career, and I thought, now's the time to really bust out creatively. And since that time, the last 2 years, I've written these two dystopian psychological thrillers that look at the strong influence of social media on our lives today. And it takes it in a very dystopian direction. It takes place in the years between 2030 and 2060. And it paints a very dark picture of computer control of our brains. Soon we are implanted with chips in our heads that give us direct transmission of computer input, and the machine gets larger and larger and learns about humans, and it learns that humans are most motivated by hatred and grievance. So the machine starts to drip into us 24/7 these messages, these fabricated storylines that stimulate hatred and grievance, and that leads to a civil war in the 2030s. That's the first book, called Restart. And then the second book that was just published last month, Reform. The computer, always smart and always learning, mutates and creates a fabricated program called Reform, which is a bunch of baloney. It's not reform at all. It's another way of manipulating humans and really numbing them down, telling humans that they're now in control, where in actuality this is just another scheme by the computer called, in the books it's called interconnect, another way of it to manipulate, constrain, and contain human beings. One of the themes throughout both books is, with such penetration of social media and computers, and by the way, I do note that today the average person spends between 3 and 5 hours on social media, the average person.
Per day.
Per day. With such deep penetration of computers, one of the themes in the near future is what happens to independent human thinking and what happens to free will and personal freedom when storylines are input to as constantly telling us, basically reinforcing our views and demonizing the other. What will happen in the next 30, 40 years, if this continues, what we see today, if it continues and becomes even more exaggerated.
And so this, you call it interconnected. Is that a sort of equivalent to the World Wide Web?
Yes, it would be. And the key was with the chip implants, the computer could operate in our minds 24/7, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, including when we're sleeping. So we are in this near future assaulted by these storylines that the supercomputer generates, and we have no ability to understand reality outside of these pseudo realities that are created by the supercomputer. Those become our realities.
In other words, it takes over the human mind in your book.
It takes over the human mind, first of all, by generating messages of hatred and grievance, and then when it mutates, it generates this lofty, soft message of reform, saying that you, the human being, you now can do anything you want in life, and yet it's just another manipulative trickery by the supercomputer.
And does the supercomputer interconnect, does that take the role of a character in the books, or is it just this all-penetrating thing that invades, or it's an infestation in the human mind?
Yeah,
Tell
although
us
it's
more about interconnect.
Yeah, although it's the protagonist, it's not it's always there. The protagonist in the story is a guy named Jared Rhodey, who is a former recovering academic, and he suffers from what are called split brain seizures, and throughout both books, he's battling between this emotional messiness of human thinking versus the easy addictive drip of interconnect. And it's so much easier for him and most people in the story to just rest with the addictive drip of the computer, which will tell you everything you need to know and you don't have to think. There's one quote in the book that says, in many ways, humans were easy prey for the machine because we were exhausted by the constant emotional drama of being human.
That's, seems to be getting more and more exhausting given your comments on the trajectory of American and many other societies and their uncivil discourse, etc. So this is an ominous type of ever-presence, and the thought just slipped my mind. But I as you were describing the main, the thought that did slip my mind just came back. It's the new opiate of the masses in a way.
Definitely.
But that the drip can't be turned off, the way I understand the novels.
Definitely.
And so the novels explore how that affects individual humans and societies or communities at large.
Correct. One of the things that fascinates me about social media and what computers can do to us is there's a study of ignorance. There's actually now ways of studying ignorance, and we normally think of ignorance as simply a gap in understanding or knowledge. We just, somebody doesn't know about something, so that's ignorant. But more and more we're becoming aware that ignorance is socially and politically constructed. And that's an interesting thought, isn't it? That ignorance is not this passive thing of a lack. It's really actively created.
By that, do you mean what we choose to pay attention to and what we choose to not pay attention to? What do you mean by ignorance is actively created? That's fascinating.
Yeah, ignorance, case in point. Let's look at a really extreme example, the QAnon phenomenon, conspiracy theories. One might say, a reasonable person might say, those people are ignorant of reality. And yet to them, that reality, that pseudo-reality, that reality is real to them. It has been created socially through social media, politically through political rhetoric. It is a fact, and in the echo chambers that they reside in, that we all reside in social media, that message of conspiracies and so forth becomes real. It is reinforced daily by a daily drip. So it's not that they just don't know, it's that they have a reality that has been created for them, a pseudo-reality, if you will. By the way, I think we all have pseudo-realities. Let's look at the political left. We have our own, we have our own containers that we operate within, and that's something that I've acknowledged as I write more and more about this. Is I also live in an echo chamber.
Well, as we all do to a certain extent. I think one of the great values of being, on this earth. I just had this other author and artist, Tom Killian, on the first half of the show, and is just getting out there in the world and disconnected. We didn't get into it very much, but, Tom Killian and I and many others spend a lot of time in the wilderness, and one of the joys about that, I know nowadays a lot of people do take their phones and satellite phones and GPS and this and that, but I'm an old school. I don't even take a compass, a few topo maps, and 20 pounds of freeze-dried in a big backpack, and I'm out there for a few weeks, and that kind of disconnect, and I took it into my daily life. I've been off Facebook or other social media, except LinkedIn, for over 10 years now. And I think that is a sort of antidote, here in Point Reyes and West Marin and in many other places around the country and the world. There's more and more programs being developed to bring people, especially including children, and into the wilderness or into the national parks or into nature to foster this type of appreciation. I know it's, in a way, veering away from your books, but it's so interesting how it is easy, in my view, there's so much dystopian fiction. I was starting to look into it a little bit just online, just seeing what's out there. It's absolutely, it seems to me, in any case, this explosion. And I'm wondering what that says about our societies where these dystopian fiction set in the near future, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20, 50, 100 years, and spinning out all these scenarios that, can appear to be plausible. What kind of comment is that saying about us nowadays?
I want to pick up on your statement about your experiences in the wilderness and disconnecting. One of the things that I used in the second book, Reform, is the hiking experience. I've hiked, I'm an avid backpacker. I've hiked over 870 miles on the Pacific Crest Trail, going back to Washington in end of July to do more. But the Reform book, Jared Rhodey, this protagonist, he is joined by a group of dissidents that are deadly, that are set against the interconnect and want to truly reform society. And he joins these dissidents on an 800-plus mile trek across this mountain range. And it's a way for this dissident group to cleanse themselves of interconnect influence. They also have a motive of getting to the server farm and attacking the supercomputer. so
different kind of monkey wrench gang.
Exactly. So the hiking experience, the wilderness experience, is a big emphasis of the second book, Reform. It's interesting that you bring that up because I think that is a way of cleansing ourselves. Maybe one of the few remaining ways of cleansing ourselves is get away from it all.
Mm-hmm. Sailing is another way. Yeah. I wonder what Edward Abbey would say about, if he would, what kind of fictions he would write nowadays. Maybe you're the new Edward Abbey.
I don't know. Let's hope. The other influence on my writing has been going back to how we started, as a social science professor for years and studying real world examples of traumatized cities. I interviewed over 360 people in those cities, 9 different cities. And a lot of those interviews I used in the first book called Restart. as Jared Rhodey meets all sorts of citizens in this country that is influenced by the supercomputer. And it was a fascinating experience writing fiction because I, of course, changed names, everything's anonymous, but I used a lot of those interviews and the feelings and emotions that those people were expressing in the real world, and I used those in the first book. And so that was a way of me kind of using my social science understanding, adapting it into a fictional setting. It was fascinating. The first book even includes fake footnotes, which I really enjoyed writing.
And some of the cities that you have researched in extensively for your work on conflict and conflict resolution in the urban settings of in Belfast and in Jerusalem and which I think Cape Town or...
It's Johannesburg in South Africa, also Nicosia, Cyprus, Sarajevo and Mostar in Bosnia, former Yugoslavia, Barcelona and Bilbao in Spain, and Beirut, Lebanon. So 9 total, over 25 years of work and those 360 interviews I mentioned.
Well, we're talking with Scott Bollens, a professor at UC Irvine and not only a social scientist who's published many books and articles and award-winning work, also now written 2 novels. One is called Reform and the other is called, the first one a couple years ago is called Restart. And they're available on Amazon. And I was looking for the publisher on these, and I couldn't quite find them. Who's the publisher of these books?
The publisher is Atmosphere Press. They're in Austin, Texas. And a shout out to independent bookstores if you want to order these books independently from the Amazon giant. They're available through bookshop.org.
Terrific. And we have a wonderful bookshop here in Point Reyes Station, and perhaps they'll have it available. I can talk to those folks as well. We have a couple more minutes, and something occurred to me. You'd mentioned at the start, Scott, that 2 of the motivating forces of interconnect are and of people that interconnect took advantage of hatred and grievance, which alas we can see some of in our societies today, although I would maintain that people are essentially good and there's a lot of good every day all around. But at the media plural seem to focus perhaps on the hatred and the grievance, especially in the political realm. But it made me think of, when you talk to stock traders and stockbrokers and people who work on Wall Street and in a city in London, et cetera, that the 2 things that are the prime motivators that override virtually everything else, and they are fear and greed. And I was just wondering, in my own mind, as a sort of mental exercise, what kind of novel would come out with this, interconnect, being, taking advantage of the human experience that would be motivated by fear and greed rather than hatred and grievance.
Well, yeah, the fear part is very much related to grievance and hatred. It's the fear of the other. The fear of change, the fear that the other, whoever the other is, the fear that the other is going to take away my life and my livelihood. I think our polarized camps in America, the similarity between the two is that they both are in fear of change, fear that the other side is going to impose their values on them. And it's interesting to look at the commonality across our polarized left-right camps in America. There is that similarity of fear. And I got the hatred and grievance part of the novels. That was based on the fact that, in real world, these cities that I studied, these traumatized cities, the trauma and the grievance and the hatred of the other is intergenerational. It is so deeply ingrained. The people, I agree with you, people are good, But the political and social situations in those cities and countries have been so traumatized, and killing and conflict, and that trauma, that grievance, is passed on intergenerationally, and we see that in city after city that are in conflict. There's a political leader that comes to the fore, and he goes way back in history and talks about the grievance of his group being unfairly treated way back in history, and he gets enough followers from that rhetoric to really stimulate political mobilization and often conflict and mass killing. Great example of that is the former Yugoslavia in the early 90s. And of course, and unfortunately, we have many contemporary examples of how history, this manipulated sense of history and grievance, is used to stimulate current political struggle and conflict and unfortunately killing.
Well, that's the way culture is, isn't it, Scott? That culture is a human's way of adapting to our world, and in conflict-ridden cities and zones, that those qualities, hatred and grievance, as you mentioned, are passed on intergenerationally through culture. It's a sort of way of adapting to, for a certain group to coalesce around certain values. And I think the questions that your novels pose are, how can we, among many others, or how can we break that kind of cycle? Scott, it's been fascinating to talk with you. In fact, we've gone over time, and so it would perhaps be wonderful to have you on again at some time in the future, maybe when your next book comes out, and to talk more in depth about these really important and interesting issues, certainly the way you've outlined them. So we've been talking with Scott Bollens, author of two recent novels. From the first one, Restart, from the year 2020, and the second one, Reform, from just last year. And I want to thank you very much for being with us, Scott. It's terrific to talk with you.
Great talking with you, Michael.
Take care. Bye. And you've been listening to KWMR 90.5 in Point Reyes Station, 89.9 in Bollens, and 92.3 in the San Geronimo Valley, along at